Hello, I can only see half the screen. Ah, there we
Hello,
go.
everyone.
As soon as you said the magic words, that did it.
Welcome, everybody. This is the Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition presenting the Energy Show. We are your hosts. I am Evan Zimmerman, Vice President of UPEC, and I am here with Horst Schmidt, UPEC President. And we are presenting our special guest, Jen Hill, Commissioner, Marquette City Council, and panelist, UP Energy Task Force. And tonight's show is called What We Don't Know About Line 5, What Troubles Us About Enbridge. Horst, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we'll have in store tonight?
Sure. This is a video from For the Love of Water, or FLOW, and it was shown on August 5th. It's called Securing a Brighter Future Without Line 5. It has four panelists, who, an engineer, a former government official, a venture capitalist, and a tribal chair. And these people will describe various aspects as it affects different parts of the whole structure of Line 5. And what I've done is I've edited so that we only hear the speakers themselves, not the rest of the video. And we'll be putting all of the material on our website. So if you want to listen to the entire video, you'll be able to. And also there will be a lot of supporting material that FLOW actually attached to this email. So we'll be able to let you see what it is. And also tonight's slideshow has a lot of content in it. So we'll be posting that as well. So it's going to be a busy show, and we're going to have to keep moving pretty fast. So why don't we move on and get to the next slide. Okay, this is the start of the Tim's presentation. What I did is earlier in the presentation, he gives examples of the Challenger explosion and the dam failure down in Midland area. And since he's basically saying the same types of things there as he will be in this one, we start on his Line 5 part of his presentation. So this will last for about, I think about 10 minutes. And then we'll have some slides that will further amplify some of what he said, and that should help us. We encourage you to ask questions, to make comments. You know, it's part of trying to figure out what we can do, and for you to learn things. And for me, it's been a learning experience, both in terms of what the speakers presented, as well as putting this together tonight. So enjoy it, and let's hope that we end up having a very fruitful discussion tonight. So go ahead, please.
Here we go.
Program to add anchors to the pipe to support it, because the original design has failed. This remediated structure is not compliant with the engineering guidelines for pipes that have been undermined, written by DNV. And obviously, some failure modes have been introduced in this pipe that weren't really a problem before. There have been anchor strikes, and most recently, there's a support that's been bent and twisted that's been in the news, but ultimately there's some other bent supports that I found by going through the inspection videos that haven't been explained. So clearly there are things going on based on inspection that weren't part of the original design and aren't failure modes that could have happened with the original design. Next slide, please. This slide is just a rehash of the points I made to you in case you want to go back over this or want to talk about it. But my slide here is where I asked the question based on forensic structural engineering. Is this line being operated in accordance with good engineering practice? So let's look at some of the lessons we just picked up. You should never ignore original design information without a thorough reanalysis. There is no documentation anywhere that Enbridge has done a comprehensive reanalysis of the structure as supported with 200 pipe supports in its channel that has currents much stronger. When remediating a problem, you have to look for new failure modes. There is no documentation whatsoever that Enbridge has considered what new failure modes, primarily failure modes having to do with what's called foreign object damage, anchors, cables, whatnot, and also vibration, which can happen in supported structures. Another lesson, that's when inspectors repeatedly find structural problems, you must take action. Well, Enbridge waited from 1954 until nearly 2003 to really start doing anything, and it's totally unclear if what they've done is effective. So what that leads me to is a hard and fast engineering opinion. In an answer to the first question on this page, I believe that Line 5 should be decommissioned until a comprehensive engineering investigation by a proven unbiased engineering firm determines why Line 5 failures keep happening. If this proves possible to make Line 5 safe, as an engineer, I can't say that that's problematic, but then and only then, the remediated design would have to be re-permitted under the Great Lakes Submerged Lands Act and other governing legislation. So really, where I end up on this very short presentation that I would be happy to stretch out much longer in a proper lecture, is that this thing is a wreck waiting to happen. It's totally consistent. When it happens and people look at what happens, they'll slap their heads and say, of course, you asked for this. And consequently, the thing should be decommissioned and thoroughly reanalyzed and thoroughly re-permitted. And so at that point, I'd like to turn my time over to the next speaker. And I hope I've made my point and am we willing to answer questions that Line 5 is a disaster waiting to happen, not for funky reasons, flaky reasons, but for very solid engineering reasons based on the learnings of 200 years of engineering disasters. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much.
That's it. Okay, if we could put on the slide.
Just a second here.
This is our more what do we call it? Sophisticated technological attempt.
So while I put that on, Horace, why don't you talk about that just a little bit?
The slide that you'll be seeing is actually the bottom part of what Dr. Tim was reading to you, and what I wanted to do it. Okay, let's go to the 2 slides down. Okay, there. Okay, so this is what he sent. Now, this is what a good engineer does. Is says you do this, this, and this. Now, as if you're familiar with the political situation, the chances of this happening are pretty remote, because the idea that Enbridge would agree to a decommission is not something that they're going to agree to. And if someone were to force them, then of course they would go to court. And then being able to get commissioned is going to be very difficult, because there's the whole issue of do they actually provide a public service that no one else can provide, and the answer probably is no. And so this is part the way an engineer looks, but we need to go on to the next speaker, and that's, let's see, Stanley Skip Pruss, who used to be a commissioner of energy for Michigan and also a former secretary in the State Commerce Department. And he presents some more physical problems that Dr. Tim did not mention, and which I had never even thought of, and then also goes into the legal and regulatory issues. This one will last about 20 minutes.
All right.
And I'm turning things over to you.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for the opportunity. This is so very important to provide people with information so we can all be on the same page. The first thing I want to do is, in a summary fashion, is sort of underscore and emphasize what Dr. Tim, the point that he had just made, by going over what we know about the risk factors. There's evidence of multiple risk factors that really indicate how vulnerable this pipeline is. And I just want to go through them briefly. So one of them, of course, are potential anchor impacts. We know of several events. In June 1979, transmission cables operated by Consumers Power Company were cut by an anchor strike. In April 2018, of course, we had those events that were in the news and quite prominent. And then most recently, there was evidence of impacts to both of the pipelines, the Eastern and Western pipeline, that may have occurred in May 2020. On July 22nd, Enbridge released its forensic report, or its report on what may have caused those most recent events. And that report indicated that it could have been yet another anchor strike, but it wasn't certain, or it could have been a mooring cable that was, or a chain that was dragged. But they also indicated in the report that there may have been a fourth anchor event, or there likely was another anchor event of some kind, because they found an anchor laying proximate to the pipelines, but Enbridge indicates in the report that it was not responsible for any of the recent impacts. There's no explanation as to why they came to that conclusion, but that is their conclusion. In addition to that, we have the possibility of catenary events. And in fact, that is a possible explanation for the last impacts to the pipelines. And a catenary event is when a tug is pulling a barge with a lengthy cable. That cable sags because of its weight. And if the barge either alters course or slows down, that sag will increase and it could drag across the bottom. We don't know exactly how much tug and barge traffic there is in the Straits, but it may be considerable. There are, based upon information, 15 large tugs that operate in the Straits, and we know that the Straits is a place of high vessel density. Third, again, and I mentioned this, the Enbridge report indicates that the damages could be caused by a cable or chain drag. Most interesting is that Enbridge, based upon vessel tracking and the database that exists that tracks all commercial vessels in real time, Enbridge narrowed down the impacts to the possibility of 13 vessels that had passed, 5 of which were under contract to Enbridge, and 4 of which Enbridge concluded could possibly account for the most recent impacts to both pipelines. And so this is significant because 3 of those vessels were doing geophysical work, presumably in preparation for work on the tunnel. And the fourth was a tug pulling a barge that was doing work for Enbridge. And so the operation and maintenance of this now elevated pipeline crossing the straits and or the geophysical work entailed in preparing for the construction of the tunnel are themselves risk factors that have already most likely impacted the pipeline and caused, had a strike to both an anchor support and both pipelines and should be of concern. So Dr. Tim talked a lot about the lack of new design analysis for the now elevated pipeline. Back in 1954, when the pipeline was being proposed, there were rigorous design analysis in 19 specific areas. 19 specific engineering analysis looked at things like vertical stress, lateral stress, pressure differentials, other things that Ed would understand and I do not understand. But the point is, there was a thorough engineering analysis that was reviewed and signed off by consulting engineers for a pipeline that was intended to lay on the bed of the Straits. Now we have a pipeline, half of which is now elevated, and we have a design that's much more complex, much more vulnerable. In the words of Ed Tim, is subject to many more failure modes, given the fact that it's elevated, and certainly seems more susceptible to anchor strikes, catenary events, and cable or chain drags. Another risk factor is the fact that Enbridge has been negligent in observing safety procedures and has, I don't say that lightly, but they have been fined. Recently, $6.7 million for neglecting pipeline safety issues. They have had numerous releases from the pipeline system, and at least 29, maybe the account now is 33 leaks and spills from line 5 since its installation, at least those that we know of. I addressed number 6, the no publicly disclosed risk analysis. Number 7, I'm going to go into more detail, but we have a lack of financial assurances in the event of a pipeline failure. And lastly, we have the reality in the Straits, this area of high vessel density, that if a vessel were to lose power, it would likely take measures to save the vessel, which would possibly mean casting an anchor. We very recently, on July 5th, the Atlantic Huron, a 736-foot Canadian vessel, lost power in the Sioux Locks and hit the Po Lock. It dropped an anchor to try and stop its momentum. Next slide, please. Moving on to the litigation efforts that have been undertaken thus far. The Environmental Law and Policy Institute, together with the National Wildlife Federation, filed suit in 2018 in order to compel Enbridge, to have the courts compel Enbridge to develop an adequate oil spill response plan. It seems pretty clear from the record and from some Coast Guard admissions that during periods of high wavelength or wave height, during storm events or high winds when the waves exceed 5 feet, or during times of seasonal ice coverage, that if there was a release from the pipeline, that remedial efforts to contain that oil spill would be very difficult, if not impossible to implement. And so ELPC and NWF sought to get that rectified. Unfortunately, in February, the courts accepted the federal court accepted the existing Coast Guard plan for spill response. The Mackinac Alliance and the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians filed a contested case proceeding before Eagle, and that contested case proceeding sought to have the agency really look at the current efforts to support the now elevated pipeline from a perspective of it being essentially a new pipeline project that should be subject to review under the Public Trust Doctrine and the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act. Unfortunately, the administrative law judge saw differently and did not sustain the arguments being advanced by the petitioners in that proceeding. We also had the action filed by Enbridge that sought to overturn the Attorney General's opinion that Public Act 359 that established the Michigan Straits Authority was unconstitutional, and the state unfortunately lost that action. We have People of Michigan versus Enbridge. This is the action currently pending before the Ingham Circuit Courts, Ingham Court of Claims. It alleges that the 53 easement should be declared void because it was never properly authorized under the Public Trust Doctrine or the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act. It is pending before Judge Jamos, and so is the matter of whether or not a permanent injunction should issue. And then lastly, there's an action by the Bad River Tribe, and I will yield to Brian Newland to talk about that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So there are, according to Enbridge's account, 18 regulatory approvals or permits or authorizations that are needed for the tunnel. And I want to talk about one of them in particular, and that's the proceeding before the Michigan Public Service Commission. But just to mention that currently pending before Eagle, before the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, are a number of permit applications for the tunnel. A permit application to authorize a water discharge, for wetland work. The proposed activity would fill, I believe, 41 acres of wetlands. There is a stormwater permit that is required, and a fourth permit as well. Next slide, please. So just a moment about the lack of financial assurances provided by Enbridge. Under all the agreements, the many agreements that people may be familiar with that were executed under the Snyder administration, the first, second, and third agreement and the tunnel agreement, none of those signatories on behalf of Enbridge was Enbridge Inc., the Canadian parent company. They were all subsidiaries of Enbridge. In fact, Enbridge has, according to expert review, 275 subsidiaries. And therefore, none of the financial guarantees that flow to the state from these subsidiaries or protect coastal communities or citizens of Michigan or the tribes may actually be sound, because based upon what was available to be reviewed by our expert, none of the subsidiaries have sufficient financial resources to respond and address a pipeline failure and the consequences of a pipeline failure. And Enbridge Inc., thus far, the Canadian parent, has not agreed to step up to the plate and provide those financial assurances directly. The state of Michigan is not named as an additional assured, and we are concerned, or the state of Michigan is properly concerned, that there is, in fact, very little coverage, perhaps no coverage at all, available in the event of a pipeline failure. Enbridge's chief financial officer in a legal proceeding in Wisconsin or in Minnesota in 2018 testified that the parent company, Enbridge Inc., would not be financially responsible for any of the activities of its subsidiaries. So that is concerning. And most recently, in the past couple of months, the governor's office and the governor's council has made the demand to Enbridge Inc. to step up to the plate, but they have not as yet. Next slide. So the tunnel authorization is also before the Michigan Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission has to make a number of findings, and hopefully the review and analysis by the Public Service Commission will be deep and comport with what the law requires. They need to determine whether or not there's a public need. They need to determine whether the tunnel actually meets safety and engineering standards, and it may very well meet safety and engineering standards. It may in fact be safer than, pipelines suspended across the Straits of Michigan and open to the risk that I just articulated. It may be designed and routed in a reasonable manner, but these findings need to be made. And the design needs to be evaluated. The commission is also required by law to determine if there are environmental impacts or potential environmental impacts from the proposed project and whether those can be appropriately mitigated. Next slide. So they have to determine whether the public benefits outweigh the potential adverse effects, and consistent with jurisprudence, federal jurisprudence and state jurisprudence across the country for federal approvals and state approvals, the Public Service Commission should determine the amount of downstream carbon emissions that would be added to the atmosphere by the lifetime operation of the pipeline, because that is relevant given what we know and our concerns about climate change. And then also, I'm reasonably confident that the Public Service Commission will also overlay a analysis under the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, and that's a two-part inquiry. Are there feasible and prudent alternatives to this pipeline? And presumably, that inquiry should look as to whether the existing pipeline network that exists in North America and in the Midwest is adequate to carry the capacity of Line 5 if Line 5 is shut down. And perhaps more importantly, under MEPA, it needs to be determined whether the building of the tunnel is and its long-term operation is consistent with public health and safety in light of the state's paramount concern for the protection of natural resources. Next slide. But most importantly, the MPSC needs to analyze regulatory risks, the prospect that given the urgency of climate change, that there will be further restrictions on oil and gas and fossil fuel development, market risk, and financial risk. So what we have is a lot of indicators indicating that a 99-year investment in fossil fuel infrastructure may not be economically prudent. We have financial institutions that many now that are of record that are concerned about lending to future fossil fuel projects. We have 17 major tar sand projects that have been canceled. We've had more than 200 oil and gas development companies file for bankruptcy since 2015. We have ongoing divestments in Albertan tar sands. Next slide, please. We have the electrification of transportation, and there are various predictions by banks and energy authorities that do deep analyses and prognostications as to what the future will be in terms of reduced oil demand, and all of those analyses conclude that there will be less oil demand in the future. We may have already hit peak oil demand presently. We have the world's auto manufacturers, virtually all of them on record that they will aggressively transition their drivetrains to electric drivetrains. We even have many countries now whose parliaments are poised to bar the future sale of internal combustion engine light-duty vehicles. And in some cases, they are even considering banning at a future date the operation of ICEs, which metropolitan areas around the country are already planning to do. In addition to these factors, we also have a number of insurance companies that have indicated that they will no longer insure pipelines, and many of which who will no longer insure coal mining or coal plant operations, including Munich Re, Zurich, Chubb, Access Capital, AXA, Aviva, Alliance, and a number of others. So that's it. I just want to sum that the most consequential thing that I want people to take away from this presentation is that there are an alarming number of risk factors, and in the aggregate, these risk factors are red flags that should, I think, strongly suggest, indeed compel a court to issue a permanent injunction, if only we could get the evidence of these risk factors before the court through authoritative experts, which we're not really positioned to do because we don't have the resources presently to retain those experts. And with that, Liz, I'll end.
Thank you, Skip.
Okay, we'll go back to our slides and we'll take a look at some of those red flags that he mentioned.
All right. Just a second here.
I think we'd be able to do this much more smoothly, wouldn't you? Considering,
Oh, it just
yeah.
takes a minute to switch between programs here. Here we go.
No, I'm not. It's just the thing. Okay, is this all right? I want to point out one agency that's was mentioned by the attorneys during the temporary restraining order hearing, which is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA. And this is from Wikipedia. And so you see it's created in 2004. They have two sections. One is pipeline safety, which is the gas pipelines in this country, and the Office of Hazardous Materials Safety. And you can see it's land, sea, and air, but it also includes the oil pipelines. And when you look at the staff number, it's 203 staff, of which 135 are inspection and enforcement staff, and that's in 2012. And I don't know whether there was an increase, not likely. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay.
Even if it's not a long one, we gotta do something. Come on, Lacey, we're going bye-bye. We're going for a walk. Come on, Lacey, we're going bye-bye.
Oh, sounds like we have a dog situation here. Second.
Yeah.
Honey.
Then we go to the next slide. I think this one is out of order. Ah, here it is. Okay. This is interesting. During the question and answer period after this presentation, Skip Press mentioned that between 2010 and 2019, 231 new lines were built, 21 of which are Enbridge. And I recall hearing in 2016 that pipeline capacity would be doubled by 2018. And a lot of this has been driven by the oil fields up in Canada, the tar sands near Fort McMurray in Alberta, the Bakken shale in Williston, North Dakota, and then the ones that are not directly affecting us, but a major producer is the Permian Basin in West Texas and Eastern New Mexico, which has been a major producer. And the purpose of all of these pipelines is to take the oil from the source to the refinery. So when you look at the number of staff and you see vast increase in the number of pipelines, we look like we're going to have more problems in the future. Just from this Wikipedia report, you can see they had almost 11,200 pipeline incidents, which averages out to about 45 to 50 per month. And 856 of those are serious incidents. So what you have is when you're talking about a minor one, one example was a pumping station in Alberta, which had a leak that let loose 170 cubic meters of oil. And so in order to make it meaningful to us, I translated the numbers into English measurements and came up with something that would allow us to understand. So there are shipping containers that we see all the time that are 20 feet long, 8 feet high, 8 feet wide. And I figured out that approximately 4.5 of those containers would have contained that 170 cubic meters. So it's not an insignificant problem, but that's what's called a small leak from a station. In 2013, the head of the PHMSA said it has very few tools to work with in enforcing safety rules. This is the head of the agency saying that. So you realize that when Enbridge calls in a spill, it's basically all emails and phone calls most likely, and all the data is supplied by Enbridge, and then the agency either agrees or disagrees with what is there, or they investigate further. But unless it's a serious incident, I suspect they don't go out most of the time to every small thing, because you're talking about 45 to 50 per month. And also the staff, if you remember the two divisions, there's 135 inspectors and enforcement personnel. So half of that would be 65 people if it's split evenly, doing the hazardous material part. And then you have all the new lines that are added on. So it's the problem of a huge volume and a very small staff. The other thing is we don't have a state inspection and enforcement service for hazardous material. I believe the state does have one for gas. So this is just an example of the kind of issue that we face with our regulatory agencies. They are not necessarily able to provide the full kind of service that's needed in order to protect us. So would you go to the next slide, please? Okay, the next. Okay, here's what struck me was the susceptibility to damage. When the state demanded that Enbridge put those anchors in, I did not realize that originally this pipeline was supposed to be on the surface of the straits, and that the scouring of the what we call the sediments removed that base. And so as they mentioned, there was nothing done from 1954 to 2003. I read somewhere that Enbridge picked up this pipeline system from Lakehead Pipeline Company in 2002. So the fault, if that is correct, it really lies with Lakehead in and not doing anything from 54 to 2002. So the other thing is you don't realize how much stress there is, and the fact that these anchors that are being put in are so susceptible now because of, we find out these cables and anchors now have an even better chance to pick up and damage the pipeline or even cause a spill. So this goes back to the design problems that Dr. Tim mentioned. So we have a new hazard that for whatever reason ships have their cables drop, or as Mr. Chris said, the catenary effect. And again, it's interesting to see that there are all these issues that as to whether or not the pipeline can be protected when we don't really know what is going on the surface of the water, and what they're dragging along at times. And again, when you look at something as simple as the catenary effect. I don't know if you're thinking about it, but when you're towing a barge that has no control on it, and if a tug has to stop, it doesn't want to get hit because it could sink. So these are the kinds of issues that no one has really thought about until these gentlemen brought some of these issues up. Next slide. Okay, we have the history of leaks and the fines record of the company. This is what caught my eye, was there's no real-time monitoring of the recent anchor damage, and so Enbridge doesn't even know when it actually occurred. It has a range, but we don't know, and so it's similar to the problem of line 6B in the Kalamazoo spill. They knew there was a problem, but they didn't realize that the problem was a rupture. And so would we have that same problem? Because if you look at the Google Earth, you'll see that the line 5 goes down under the straits on the St. Ignace side, and that's where they have some type of pipes and one or two structures, but there's no one there to monitor that, as far as I can tell. So if they're doing any monitoring, it would have to be in their headquarters. So could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, the tunnel law that the Attorney General Nessel was not able to prevail on. I just saw this article by Jim Olson, who's an attorney and the founder of Flow. He points out that the loss may not be important enough to appeal, because the main issue is closing down the pipeline, and that can only be done through the lawsuit and the Michigan Public Service Commission deciding whether or not they meet the conditions of the public trust. So the important case in this case is both the violations of the 1953 easement and which is still underway. Next slide. Okay, regulatory approvals for tunnel. Is it the silo approach? Does the Army Corps have its own thing and doesn't consult with anyone else? Does Eagle just do its thing with the application process? What is the Fish and Wildlife Service going to do? So none of this is really explained to us. So you wonder, does Enbridge take advantage of this multi-jurisdictional control? And so I'm, always wondering about these things nowadays. And then with the Water Resources Division of Eagle, is it able to provide effective, continuous oversight in light of having an adequate staffing, as we've seen with the dams? They have two people providing inspections for the dams that the state actually has the authority to inspect. And that just occurred to me how much we put into fighting terrorists internally. As I understand it, about $4 trillion have been spent from 2002 until now. And you don't really see any major outbreaks. And yet, when it comes to the dangers posed to our environment, the resources are almost impossible to see. And then this is where we need to take a look at how we prioritize our spending in our federal budget. Next, please. Okay, this is Ian Bund. He's a venture capitalist, and he's going to spend a little more time on Enbridge's financial situation, and again, cover some of the points that Attorney Press mentioned.
All right, shall we move to the video? All right, and here is Ian Bund.
Brink, and it ended up with this rather modest title. But if you look at Enbridge, you will see the following. It's a very complicated company, 250 companies and partnerships. And that's being done to contain their risks so that if an activity fails, the parent company can walk without having to bail out the activity. It may have some fines and costs to pay, but it sees that as just simply part of the cost of doing business. So when you look at the last 15 to 18 months, when Enbridge has had at least 10 major line ruptures and failures, typically what they've done is shut the line, pay their fines, move on. It's a well-known fact in the pipeline business that lines are run until failure. That's the industry norm, and Enbridge is the biggest in the industry and the baddest. Their total focus is on today's cash flow. Skip just covered the insurance situation. In fact, Enbridge is largely self-insured. They did have insurance going into the Line 6B failure, but exhausted most of it and are still arguing with their insurance carriers on that. The recent request by the state of Michigan to cover the event of failure has been really met with vague, unsupported promises. But the study that led to that Skip referred to is very astute and worth looking at. When you take a look at any information coming out of Enbridge, including a press release a few days ago, it usually has very little to do with the facts. When you look at their financial reporting, which I follow closely, you see them emphasizing their distributable cash flow. But in reality, they are spending the bulk of their cash flow on paying out dividends, which I think over time is going to become kind of an empty promise to financial markets because it's not sustainable. If you look at their latest quarterly report, where they claimed to have had 2.1 billion of positive cash flow, in fact, the company was supported by borrowing another 6.9 billion, taking their aggregate balance sheet borrowings to close to $80 billion. Missing from their accounting is the reserves to cover self-insurance. So they've made these promises to all sorts of regulatory authorities all over the country and in Canada. None of those are supported by proper assurances or insurance. They have a huge deferred maintenance that is not reserved. And then when they merged with Spectrum about 3 years ago, quite a large operator in itself, they brought to the table another grouping of obsolete properties and pipelines whose value, in my view, is grossly impaired. Their financial statements do not recognize any impairment. So I think the big issue with Enbridge is why their stock's yielding 7.6%, which is a yield almost 3 times comparable size companies. The real thing with Enbridge is there's just no trust. The market does not trust them, investors do not trust them, regulators do not, tribal leaders do not. And from an investor point of view, you're looking at the payment of dividends at a rate that are not supported by earnings and are only supported by taking on additional debt. So in my view, the red herring called the tunnel here in the Straits is simply another ploy by Enbridge to buy time to earn its daily cash flow from Line 5. That cash flow is prodigious if you relate it to its 2019 results. It is about 9% of the company's total cash flow. And if you look at it from a net cash flow, it's about 8%. So they're doing everything possible to put Band-Aids on this obsolete pipeline in order to protect that cash flow. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
So there you have another view, not a very pretty one, of Enbridge's financing. It reminds me of another Enron, which used to hide its debt so that it looked like it was actually income. So simply some financial games that the company is playing. I have the slides when you're ready.
All right, just a second here. It is always about the money, isn't it?
Yes, that's the game. All right, let's go to the slide here. This is a lot of this information is from a report that the state commissioned on Enbridge's finances, and I picked a few things out. And I'm repeating some of the things that the others have said, but I think it's important to realize that Enbridge Inc. is Canadian. Enbridge here in the US, in however many of those 275 subsidiaries there are basically just sort of a shell game. And one of the things that you find is that the money goes to Enbridge in Canada, but the liabilities stay with the subsidiaries. So if we wanted to get Enbridge to pay on a thing, we would have to basically beg them to clean up their mess. This statement on the bottom is interesting because it's basically saying that without that money that Mr. Bunn was talking about, that 8%, 9% return, Enbridge has nothing. Next slide, please. So, what would excuse me, a straight spill look like if we take a look at the Kalamazoo River spill? So we have a $1 billion cleanup cost. The state fined them $177 million, along with the fine that's of $61 million in that amount. So it took 10 years to be released from the liability by the state this year, actually. And so what we're seeing here is the Kalamazoo River in relation to the Straits is basically almost a ribbon. So, what the width is, I don't know, but it can't be more than half a mile in a non-dam portion. And so when you multiply that on the Straits, then you wonder how much it will be. This report mentions that it could be upwards of $40 billion to clean up. So down here, the Enbridge's real tunnel strategy. This is from Howard Lerner, the second slide from Mr. Bunn's talk in an article that he wrote 2 years ago for Cranes in Detroit. And so he's seeing this is what they're really going to do, which is to spend money on permitting and planning processes, and then continue to run the, at that time, 65-year-old pipeline, and then hold off on spending the really big money, but of course they would have to borrow in order to go through with the actual building process. So as Mr. Bunn pointed out, this is not economically sensible if oil prices stay low, and right now we know they are staying low because there's much less demand. Next slide. Okay, our final speaker is Brian Newland, who's the chair of the Bay Mills Indian community, and he will be talking about treaty rights and also going over some of the points that the others have made, but again, from a tribal perspective.
Sure, Miigwech, thanks for having me, Liz, and thanks to all of you for joining us today on this to discuss this important topic. Liz mentioned that there are 12 federally recognized tribes here in the state of Michigan, and it often comes as a surprise to people that every square inch of this great state was at one point owned and governed by sovereign tribal nations. When we get to issues like the Line 5 pipeline, for example, a lot of times skeptics and policymakers look at tribes as though we are some sort of front group for other interests and that we don't have important interests of our own. So I want to walk you through briefly why that isn't the case for us here with respect to the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline. And then I want to pull back the lens and talk generally about the permitting process for this tunnel project. But, generally speaking, Bay Mills Indian Community is one of more than 30 bands of Ojibwe tribes in the United States. And we have a cultural interest in the waters of the Great Lakes in general, but also the Straits of Mackinac in particular. So many of you are no doubt familiar with the story in the Bible of the Great Flood and Noah and Mount Sinai. Well, in our history and our cultural teachings, we have a similar story as well of a flood that covered the earth. And then when the earth was remade, it was remade upon the back of a turtle that came out of the floodwaters, and that's where the earth was reborn and our culture was renewed. And our teachings tell us that that great turtle arose from the water actually where Mackinac Island is. And the Ojibwe word for turtle is Michiganders, which may sound familiar to some of you. And so the waters and the lands around the Straits of Mackinac are sacred to us, as sacred as Mount Sinai is for people who worship and practice religious beliefs found in the Bible. And so we are talking about a pipeline that jeopardizes the literal birthplace or rebirth place of our planet. And so our tribes have a cultural interest in protecting the Straits of Mackinac and the spiritual integrity of the waters and lands in the area. In addition, we have a number of ceremonial sites and burial sites in and around the Straits area that could potentially be damaged by a tunnel project. So on top of our cultural interests, the tribes also have a legal interest. If we can go back to the first slide, I'll talk about that. So you see there, this is a map of all of the treaty cessions that tribes made of lands in the state of Michigan to the United States. In 1836, that yellow area that comprises the top half of the Lower Peninsula and the eastern half of the Upper Peninsula, the five Ojibwe and Odawa bands in northern Michigan signed a treaty with the United States. The state of Michigan did not exist in 1836. And through that treaty, we ceded all of that yellow territory that you're seeing on your screens to the United States. And that treaty and that land cession actually allowed the state of Michigan to be admitted to the Union as one of the United States just a year later in 1837. But in exchange for giving up all that land, all of our homelands, we kept a few things for ourselves. And one of the things that we kept is the right to hunt, fish, and gather throughout the waters and lands that we ceded as we had been accustomed to doing. And that right has been upheld in various federal court decisions and is actually the subject of a famous case called the United States versus Michigan. That case has to deal with tribal treaty fishing rights in the Great Lakes in the boundaries of that ceded territory. And that right has been upheld. And we actually co-manage the Great Lakes fishery with the state of Michigan and the federal government in those waters. So now we know that the tribes have a cultural interest in protecting the Straits of Mackinac. We have a legal interest in these waters. We also have an economic interest in protecting the Straits of Mackinac in these waters. Here at Bay Mills and at the Sault Ste. Marie tribe, our tribal economies are heavily dependent on tribal commercial fishing. And like everywhere else in northern Michigan, we're also heavily dependent on tourism to northern Michigan. to support our local businesses. So anything that's going to jeopardize commercial fishing in these waters, as well as our tourism economy, is going to jeopardize our very existence. So you got a little bit of background on why do tribes really care about this issue? Are you just a front for other radical Antifa type groups, right? That they throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. And we have legitimate legal, cultural, and economic interests to the lands and waters around the Straits of Mackinac. So that's the jumping off point for why tribes like Bay Mills Indian Community have become engaged in the permitting and legal process that the previous speakers have addressed before. Now, one of the things that we have in this country with respect to environmental protection is the Federal Environmental Protection Act. And ever since that law was passed, these companies like Enbridge have tried to do what's called segment their projects. Because if you have a big enough project that is going to jeopardize the public health or jeopardize the environment, if you can cut it up into smaller pieces, and you can sometimes get away with having each one of those small pieces evade significant governmental review for environmental impacts. And so over the years, we've seen with Enbridge now, they file these applications for one screw anchor permit, a couple others here, let's dredge under the pipeline there. What they've really been able to do is redesign and re-engineer the Straits crossing out of the public eye and without any meaningful environmental review from federal or state agencies, because they've cut it up into tiny pieces. Now, this tunnel project is itself segmentation because its intent is to keep the entire Line 5 pipeline in operation from end to end. The Line 5 pipeline, as many of you may know, spans 645 miles from Superior, Wisconsin to Sarnia, Ontario, using the state of Michigan as a shortcut, and it crosses through 3 Great Lakes watersheds. And this tunnel will all but ensure that the entire pipeline stays in operation. And there are other problems along the length of this pipeline that were alluded to in prior presentations that also jeopardize the long-term operation of this pipeline. For example, the Bad River Indian Reservation in northern Wisconsin actually has Line 5 cut across the reservation. And Enbridge had a right-of-way to operate the pipeline through the reservation, and that right-of-way has expired. They are presently operating the Line 5 pipeline across the Bad River Indian Reservation in trespass. So they have no legal right to continue to operate, but they're doing it anyway. And if they can piece enough of these permits together, they can ensure that the Line 5 pipeline as a whole stays in operation. So the other part, so we've been engaged in this process in different stages. The other part that is going on now, we talked about the Eagle permitting process. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is involved here as well. And Skip mentioned in his presentation or his discussion that the MPSC is going to evaluate the structural integrity and safe operation of the Line 5 pipeline. When our tribe first engaged with the MPSC in tribal consultation, we put the question to them very bluntly: has the MPSC ever denied a permit for an oil pipeline? And the answer was no. And we asked about the process they use to evaluate the structural integrity of the pipeline itself. And they said it is not really their job to determine whether the pipeline is designed safely, that they're really going to rely on Enbridge itself. And we asked the same question of the Army Corps of Engineers. We said, you guys, the name of your agency is literally the Army Corps of Engineers. Are you going to evaluate the structural design of Enbridge's proposed tunnel? And are you going to assess whether this pipeline can safely operate in that configuration? And the answer was, that's not our job. We do not evaluate the safety of the Line 5 pipeline. We're going to defer to Enbridge. So if you pull back and you look as a whole, we're segmenting all this permitting process up into little pieces. It becomes apparent that there is no regulatory agency at the federal or state level that looks at the Line 5 pipeline, whether it's suspended above the lake bed as it is now or put inside a tunnel. There's no agency that says that is safe. And so really what we have is Enbridge telling us we can do this, it's safe, take our word for it, and nobody to verify that process. If you all remember the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that was a wake-up call for a lot of us because we looked at that, we said, there's all these oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and they are drilling for oil in waters that are 2 and 3 miles deep. There's got to be some kind of safety plan. There's got to be a contingency plan for when things go wrong. This must be safe. And we were all shocked to learn that that is not the case. And the same is true with respect to the Line 5 pipeline and the proposed tunnel here in the Straits. There's nobody at the wheel. There's nobody watching to make sure this is safe, and we are all being expected to take Enbridge's word for it. The last thing I wanted to hit on before we turn it over to you for question and answer is, again, going back to Skip's presentation. He gave an overview of litigation. 2 things. First, Bay Mills Indian community has proposed to intervene in the Michigan Public Service Commission review of Enbridge's permit, and we're awaiting a ruling on that. But there's another lawsuit that has been going on for several years out of the public's eye that directly affects the Line 5 pipeline. And that is a case called the United States versus Enbridge. The EPA sued Enbridge in 2016 for all kinds of safety violations along with what's called the Lakehead system. The Lakehead system is all of Enbridge's pipelines that it operates in the upper Great Lakes, including the Line 5 pipeline. And that lawsuit was filed mostly to address the Kalamazoo River oil spill and other oil spills in Illinois. But tucked away, they filed that lawsuit, the EPA did, and they settled it with Enbridge the same day. And tucked away in that settlement agreement was a passage saying that Enbridge had to maintain safe operations of the Line 5's pipelines Straits crossing. And in the last 4 years, Enbridge and the EPA have modified that settlement agreement a number of times. That's where these screw anchor supports come from. Those were required by the EPA in the settlement agreement. And these negotiations, because it's litigation and because they are settlement discussions, they occur out of the public eye. They're not a regulatory permitting process. They're not put out for public hearing and public notice and comment. This is government lawyers and Enbridge lawyers sitting down together to work out changes to the settlement agreement. And a lot of these proposals that Enbridge has come out with in recent years flow directly out of that lawsuit and the settlement agreements. And a lot of what is going on with the Line 5 pipeline is being negotiated behind closed doors as part of that lawsuit and these friendly settlement agreements that Enbridge has been able to negotiate with the EPA. So with that, I'll stop. And I appreciate you, Liz, for organizing. You and the folks at Flow have been great allies. Appreciate the work you guys are doing. Appreciate you inviting me on to give a little bit of perspective on why Michigan's tribes care so much about this issue. And I look forward to answering questions. Miigwech.
Okay, so that's our last speaker, and basically when he's talking about regulatory agencies, it's not my job answer, and that's not acceptable as far as we're concerned. And so there's two things on the slide that I wanted to mention. One is that the it's a case of sacrificing the fishing grounds for keeping the pipeline running or possible pollution if the tunnel project goes on. I've been told that the fishing grounds east of the bridge are some of the best in the Great Lakes. And so if the tribes want to keep these fishing grounds productive, we have to be sure that either there's no pipeline that will pollute, and also that possible pollution from the tunnel project does not cover the sediments in the areas where the fish are thriving. So it's similar to the problem of the sands covering the Buffalo Reef cobbles, and where they're gradually losing productivity because of the copper that's in the sands that is acting as a superside to take the growth of algae that's on those cobbles. So we want to be sure that whether it's the Buffalo Reef or whether it's the pollution from any tunnel projects, that we don't
here's a black bear.
those grounds. So that's the end of
Huge
that.
black bear in Maple Bay. Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
I think that might have been a mistake. Continue on, Horst.
Yeah. So anyway, our last speaker is live, and it's Jen Hill. And what I wanted to do is ask her if she could go through some of the 14 recommendations that show why we don't need Line 5. And I think it's important to show how, when you have a governor who's willing to look at the whole picture, that we can actually come up with a workable plan. And perhaps you can tell us if there's been any movement on any of those recommendations.
Thank you, Horst. Thank you, everyone, for joining this incredibly important conversation. I am so glad that you had a chance to rebroadcast those remarks from earlier in August. It's really does bring it all together in a really coherent way. So the UP Energy Task Force was convened a year ago, June 2019, with 2 tasks. The first task was to look at the propane system for Michigan and predominantly the Upper Peninsula. And then second, look at the entire energy system of the Upper Peninsula, electricity, heat, and think about what might need to happen around our electricity as well as the propane. So we were not directly, I just want to be really clear, this was not about Line 5. As Horst said, it was this bigger picture question of what can our future look like in the Upper Peninsula, given the disruptions that we know are likely to happen in our region. And so we started grounded in the idea that with climate change and unforeseen circumstances such as infrastructure failures, that we need to have contingencies and plan Bs, Cs, and Ds. So with propane, that is the most significant energy source that is not regulated. All of our other energy sources and our utilities, electricity, water, telephone, cable, television, and internet, those all are regulated in some way, but propane is pretty much unregulated. So how does that system work? Who influences what? Where are the pricing signals coming from? All those questions. We dove into all the details. And what we found is that propane is a byproduct of taking oil and petroleum products that and is never made by itself for its own use. So propane is a sort of subsidiary to other things happening in the oil and gas market. And then on top of that, the propane use in the Upper Peninsula is 20% of the households. So, and we attempted to try to find out how many of those households are seasonal. And it turns out that's a very challenging thing to do. And we were not able to really identify which propane users are seasonal and which are not. You can identify from natural gas pipeline maps, who's a likely community that's using natural gas and which ones are using propane, but you can't say that for sure. So, well, it's not a significant amount of Upper Peninsula residences. It is, of course, for those households, very important to have access to propane. And what we found is that there was one wholesaler serving the entire Upper Peninsula, and it's 13 or 15 different retail establishments. So there was a choke point in the system. And even I think in the process of our now 18 months of convening and discussing and looking at issues, we now have two wholesalers in the Upper Peninsula, the Rapid River, and then also over in Kinross, there's a rail yard where propane is delivered by rail car from the Sioux, Canada. So the system has already changed just in the last 18 months around propane as different things have happened both globally with the COVID and changes in the oil market, and then locally with what we've been doing, I think, to bring a lens, try to start to bring a lens of transparency to the propane energy system, which had been, as I said, entirely unregulated. So what did we find? What we found is that we think there's three things broadly that we can do to prevent disruptions and shocks to the propane supply in the Upper Peninsula, causing prices to spike or there to be not enough propane for our communities to heat themselves in our winters. First is adding storage locally. That includes the retail establishments increasing their capacity to store, so basically adding more of those big bullet tanks, which happened, again, the system sort of self-corrected after the polar vortex winter of 2013-14, when it was so cold and we had that price shock and that real lack of supply, because three things happened at once that one wouldn't have expected inside the larger system, including the need to dry corn in Iowa, the breakdown of a refinery in Superior, Wisconsin, and the fact that Line 5 was in fact doing scheduled maintenance meant that we had this great shock where propane could not be accessed and you had to drive hundreds of miles further away. At our very first meeting in St. Ignace in July of 2019, so our second meeting in July of 2019, the Propane Association of Michigan stood up and said, we are never going to let that happen again. So, and I believe them. I think that was so disruptive to them because then people wanted to move away from propane because it's so unreliable. So I think it's important to understand that the system is constantly moving and changing, and even the retailers felt like the system wasn't serving them. So we've increased the amount of storage so that the propane is already here, and as those tanks are filled up in the warmer months. The second is to add layers of consumer protection. With an Attorney General, Dana Nessel, being such a strong consumer advocate, then can we change our laws so that wholesalers who are doing price gouging can be taken to court, not just retailers? Because again, we found that that was the problem in our system. And improving price transparency overall. So I have, and I can share in the chat, the Michigan Public Service Commission does compile and post the price of propane in Michigan during the period from October to March. But there is a national collection at the Energy Information Association. So I just put in the chat the two different places where you can see, now this is statewide, again, so not just the UP, where prices are and how they might be changing. And of course, they've been very low for the last 12 months, mostly because of things that are happening globally, meaning that we have too much oil and gas sloshing around in the system. And again, because propane is a byproduct, it is there. Could it be, and it looks like it will be there. There will be this excess for a little while longer. And then some of the other bucket. So there's price transparency, there's increasing storage, and then there's improving access through making it possible for low-income folks and folks on very unfixed incomes to have better access to propane when it's inexpensive, right? If you fill your tanks in the summer when things are warmer and there's not such a demand, you would hopefully pay a lower price, but do folks have the kind of cash available to make that happen? And are there ways that current federal heating subsidy programs that are implemented by the state and local nonprofits could improve this system? And they've been working hard on that. More to come there, and I'd be happy to share resources and conversations. There are policy meetings happening on that on a regular basis. And then there's the idea of just adding rail, so adding, increasing the ability to bring propane on tanks by rail car into the Upper Peninsula. It's not entirely clear to me that that is actually needed, again, because of what's going on in Superior, Wisconsin, and other refineries and rail lines in Wisconsin. The pricing, it might make prices go up 10 cents maybe or less. And if we had more storage in the UP to begin with, that would be less of an issue. So and then I have, and I will pull into the chat a list of the 14 recommendations that are organized by what agency could possibly implement them, which is, I think, the most important. Another way to think about this is, well, we've got the recommendations by how they impact the system, but we also have the recommendations organized by how we could actually implement them and make them happen. So I'm going to stop here. Any questions? I covered a lot of ground, and I would love to be able to answer any questions folks might have.
So, Evan, do we have any questions on the chat?
We do. We have some excellent comments here from Bob Kramer and from Connie. If Bob, if you'd like to speak, you're welcome to turn on your microphone and talk. I could also read what you've put here. It's like we have a lot of great info.
Even though I'm a Republican, I'm very concerned about all of this, and this is just an incredible discussion, and I thank you for doing this, especially the tribal view. But I've been in the public relations game commercially and for the federal government for well over 40 years, almost 50 years. And every time I go to my social media page, I just am bombarded by the super PAC about, sign the petition to protect Michigan jobs. And I've got my 80 and 90-year-old aunts and uncles calling me, asking me whether they should sign the petition, and they were going to do it. And of course, we all know that loss of jobs is a false narrative, but the bottom line is, they are just spending a ton of money hiring political consultants and social media companies to get their point across. And they're successful because every time I drive to my home in Wisconsin from Indian River through the UP, I see all these signs, support the tunnel, support the tunnel. And that tells me we're losing the war. And, I don't know how to counteract it because it appears that despite the efforts of the state of Michigan, we just don't have a centralized clearinghouse or a super PAC or a PAC that can offset the huge expense that Enbridge and their super PAC or their PAC seem to be engaging on. So, I really salute especially the tribe for the tribes for getting this darn thing stopped for the moment. But I fear that that's going to be only temporary. And when I talked to the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council the other day, I didn't know this, but apparently that the Line 5, once it leaves the Straits, Enbridge either leases or owns all that land. And according to the Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council, no one has any oversight over that pipeline. And we know that, like east of Burt Lake on the inland waterway, you can't even get to the pipeline. It's inaccessible. If there's a leak, it could go on forever. In Sheboygan County in April, because of COVID, we had a 43% unemployment rate due to COVID. So just think what would happen if the partially exposed Line 5 line in Indian River, Michigan, that crosses Indian River had a catastrophic event. It would totally destroy the beautiful, what we call the spreads between Indian River and Mullet Lake and the city of Sheboygan and out into Lake Huron. So there's more than just the Straits at stake here. And I really like the presentation about the dividends and the inability to sustain that dividend, because what that tells me is if there's any catastrophic event, they'll just walk away. They'll declare bankruptcy. But y'all are smarter about this than me. I'm kind of new at getting into this, but I'm just worried about the information war, and they seem to be winning. And I just hope there's a way to counteract that. And I don't have a solution. I usually like to give solutions, but I just don't have one right now.
Well, so one of the purposes of the task force is to provide the opportunity for a conversation around what else is possible besides, right, this idea that we have to tie ourselves to the fossil fuels economy. The 17 members of the task force, 12 of them are from the UP. And we are, we've published since the time, with the help of some of the people on the call here, instrumental to making sure that we get op-eds and letters to the editor in UP newspapers with an understanding that we are not dependent on Line 5 for heating in the UP. It's not, the system has already changed from the 2013-14 crisis, and we can move on and have other sources and do things to make it better. But right, these are, and so if one thing to do is to continue to help us share that message in local newspapers and local social media outlets. We have templates and things available to help share that message. I can share tentatively plans for a clean energy conference for the Upper Peninsula. That's tentatively scheduled to happen between Election Day and the opening of deer season, so the second week of November. We're hoping to pull that together. More to come on that. Again, trying to sidestep some of the politicalization of this to just say, this is how we can do this. And this is what's possible. And it's cheaper and less expensive, and you can manage it yourself and not rely on others and things coming here from another country, but it's tapping into that self-reliance as well.
And when I retired here 5 years ago to my second home in Indian River from the Pentagon, there were everywhere in Indian River, Michigan and Sheboygan County were signs that say, shut down Line 5. And now I don't see those anymore. I see support the tunnel. And that tells me we're losing. And I know everyone's trying their best, but Enbridge has unlimited resources. They're going to spend whatever it takes. And until we, in my opinion, until we can get a PAC or a super PAC with adequate donations from folks like myself and other organizations, they're going to continue to win this information war. The legal war is one thing, but the information war is another. So I hear everything you're saying, and I've written my own letters to the editor, and I've sent out a bunch of emails, and I posted stuff on Facebook, but I just believe there has to be a centralized, concerted effort somehow, either through a PAC, a super PAC. I mean, these guys, they know how to play this game.
Right.
And, I'm wondering if anyone else out there has seen any of their aggressive advertising on social media. I mean, they're just masters at it.
Right. And the lack of media diversity in our communities is the other piece of that. The number one, the pretty much sole television outlet in the UP is Fox, and then right behind it is Sinclair. So it is a challenge. I can put you in touch with the folks at Liz Kirkwood, who was the moderator of the event that Forrest and Evan were sharing, as well as Jim Lively at the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities and their Great Lakes Business Alliance, which has now over 150 members. And those are businesses that are dependent on clean water and are willing to be stand up and say, this is necessary for our future.
That's very, very good, Jen, because I think part of the impression that Bob is giving is that the other side is winning, but there are a lot of people who don't speak out, and they have their views that are similar to ours, and so it's easy to get pessimistic when you hear the propaganda, but this is one of the reasons why we're doing these shows, so that people have an opportunity to hear more than they would on our limited media networks that we have here in the UP. So it's really, really important to keep that in mind. But anyway, I want to thank you, Jen, for giving that very thoughtful presentation, because I thought it's even better than I thought it would be. So it's because it actually provided me with information I hadn't had before, and I think that's always important, for people to realize, and so that's one of the reasons why I decided this was an excellent program for us to get the view that we may not have heard from these gentlemen today, and then be able to, go from there. So
I'd like to make a comment here. I hope somewhere in here is now a good time.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Yes, this pipeline is 685 miles long, if I remember correctly, and it goes across all sorts of rivers and watersheds and whatever. And I follow Wisconsin. Actually, my dad was born on the Bad River Reservation. And so I'm familiar with the situation over there as well. It's 67 years old. It's very old with the steel fabrication and the technology and the installation equipment and whatever. From 67 years ago, it has a lot of problems. And actually, Line 3 over in Minnesota, there's a push now by the pipeline company to replace a big section of it. And they say that it's old and corroded and subject to failure. So it seems to me that this one is probably as older than Line 3 that they want to replace this section. It just seems so logical that they really should be looking at, if they're going to have a pipeline, it should be a total replacement with total new materials, totally re-engineered, and then let's talk about it again. Because it's really a problem with the Bad River. The Bad River is called the Bad River because it very often floods. The last one was really a major flood, record flood. And with climate change and that sort of thing, that's the sort of thing we're going to be dealing with. And if it had a break there, that would be catastrophic for, the whole reservation and such, and then down into Lake Superior, down into our watershed. And now they want to move it south, and they're really pushing to move it south, which will cost them a lot of money. But as far as I'm concerned, they should look at the specifics of the structure and all of the issues with the whole pipeline. 67 years old is really old. I thought I heard that it had a 50-year lifespan. That's what they planned on, 50 years. Well, they're already 17 years over that. It's time for a total review. And so that'll be enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we also had a comment earlier from Connie saying a small group of undergrad students designed this pipe for an undergrad Michigan Tech class. They are not engineers. Yikes.
I remember that presentation, Evan, out of Tech. So
I wanted to say too that the other thing the undergrads did not know is what Enbridge ultimately found with the core samples. What they found with the core samples really indicates they can't do this. There's nothing flat about the bottom of the straits. There's a lot of rubble, and there is like a canyon that you have to go under in order to stay in bedrock. It can't be done. And so I don't know why we're still talking about it. I think Bob has a good point, but on the other hand, I'm seeing just a lot more people attending these meetings because they are virtual. And in the Upper Peninsula, we can do this now. We can go to these meetings because we don't have to drive someplace, drive for 6 hours to get to a meeting. So this has been amazing. It's been an amazing burst of energy and information sharing. So I don't know about all those signs. I'm sure that, they can afford a lot of signs. And I don't know how, where this is happening, maybe at union meetings, I don't know. But I would say that we are also moving forward with an information battle.
I definitely agree with that. I think we're at a turning point right now with information. People all over are fed up with the amount of disinformation that's out there. It's become universally recognized. It doesn't matter what political side you're from. Everyone knows that our information channels are getting congested right now, and we need to build new ones. And so I think we're right at the beginning, and we have a link here from Jen Hill here for the Great Lakes Business Network. I've copied that to Facebook. I think that's an example of the type of organization that's starting to bring people together and bringing businesses and community members into a situation where they can really talk about this and start to make change. And it has, in some ways, taken this pandemic to get people more connected to each other. And I think that this, like you're saying, this really is the start of something new, and these connections are going to play out. And if we keep talking with each other and we keep spreading this information, it will have an effect. I've been inspired by people all over the world. I've especially been looking at what's been happening in Taiwan recently. They've been experimenting with radical transparency from the government because they're under constant disinformation attacks. And they've been publishing information. They've been making it more available to people. They've been using software and other techniques in order to show people what people really think. And the surprising thing they found is that people are a lot more reasonable than most people think. People hear extreme views about things, and people think that that's normal because of the fact that often it's the extremists who are the loudest. It's the people that are paid to say things in some cases that are the loudest. And a tiny fraction in a lot of cases gets to control the information that people have. But as we start to talk to each other, as we spread good information, as we're transparent about how this is coming about, as we're transparent about the interests behind it, people are very willing to get involved in this and very willing to listen. And I think that things will turn around if we continue like that.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, I still have my shutdown line 5 in my yard. And by the way, that sign survived the terrible winter, and it was there. I couldn't get to it, but it was still there in the spring. And it survives very bad weather, those signs. We probably need to get more of them up here. We need to talk to the folks downstate and get more of those signs up here. Everybody should have one in their yards.
Sounds like a good idea. Perhaps we can get a link to where we can get the signs.
Oil and water don't mix. And they could probably send a crate up here, especially if we're willing to pay for them. But I mean, that's the other thing, is somebody has to pay for all those signs. But what if we paid for our own?
Sounds like a good idea.
I have a question, probably for Jen. You know, in Brian Newland's presentation, what was very alarming, and I heard it, you know, the first time around too, and that is how he talked about segmenting the permits. And that various agencies were so specialized. It's like a doctor. You're specialized to go to a doctor, and you see many doctors, and there's no one to pull it all together for you. And that's exactly, it seems to be what is happening with all the permits that Enbridge has been applying for. So the question I have is anyone in the government or local government or the state of Michigan looking at this fractionation of permits, and how do we tie those together so we do get a clear big picture of what's going on?
So two responses. One is because I'm on the task force and hear the chatter at lunch and things like that, so not official communications, but hear what's going on. I know that Eagle leadership meets regularly with tribal leadership. This is behind just relationship building and things like that. Not to say that it's cozy, I don't think it is, but those relationships do exist, I think, in a really fundamental way that they did not exist under the previous administration. So that perspective that Chairman Newland brought, I know Eagle knows that. The leadership of Eagle is aware of that. And I think, I know also because I have met the lead attorney, one of the lead attorneys for the Environmental Law and Policy Center. So Howard Lerner is their executive director. Their Michigan person is a woman based in Grand Rapids named Marguerite. oh, I just lost her last name. I went to Marguerite Henry, who writes those kids books about ponies, but sorry, but it's been a long day. Anyway, the attorney for the ELPC, Environmental Law and Policy Center, is also, I mean, those folks are thinking about these questions and trying to find those legal avenues. And that's kind of, in this process, it's been uncovered of how hard and challenging this is, but they are certainly looking at it and talking to each other and meeting with each other. Marguerite has been to the UP more than once. I've met with her here in Marquette. So it is there, but you know, I think flow, oil and water don't mix, are also trying to raise some of these issues as well. And I'm going to post, I wish I forgot to mention this. So of course on Monday is the next time you can speak with the Michigan Public Service Commission, 4 to 7 p.m. on August 24th. I believe that's Monday. I'm going to put that link up in here on the chat. There's an electronic public hearing on August 24th to take input on Enbridge's request for siting authority of its plans to relocate Line 5 pipeline. It's 4 to 7 on Monday, the 24th. So here's the link for that. And those who wish to comment are strongly encouraged to pre-register by 3 p.m. They're anticipating hundreds of people are going to comment. So, which is wonderful. You can also, and there's ways to mail and different ways of accessing. It's all listed on the link that I sent. So sorry, that's probably a long answer, Rosemary. I'm sorry, but
no, that's good. I'm glad it's being considered. You know, I think this panel of speakers that UPEC has just shared, and that was on last, a couple of weeks ago, they seem to have raised issues that I have not been aware of, and I think other people too. So would Eagle and some of the other agencies be seriously looking at what this group of speakers have said?
Well, and that's this. So now, the conversation has moved to the Michigan Public Service Commission. So this is a body that is within the state of Michigan, but not a state agency because it is a regulatory commission. Mm-hmm. It is chartered by state statute. There are 3 people appointed by the governor. The current 3 we have are all fantastic environmentalists. I use that term. I'm serious. Sally Talberg, Dan Scripps, and Tremaine Phillips are who we want there, sitting in those seats making these decisions. Their hands may be tied a little bit on what the law says, but I'm confident because they are such strong, committed folks on doing the best for our environment. They can ask staff to push in directions, particularly when the comments come in saying, do this. Mm.
Well, one thing I want to mention is that Water Resources Division is taking the application from Enbridge for the tunnel very seriously. And initially, I think they rejected it because it was inadequate in terms of the information required. The other thing is they did have what I would call a PR meeting where they explained what they were going to be doing, and then there would eventually be probably another information session and hearing on the application. So we'll see where that goes. It's important to realize there's so many things going on that we really don't know. I thought I had the whole thing under wraps when I wrote an article on it, and then all of a sudden this program that we have here tonight just blew that out of the water. So and also it's very dynamic. We're expecting the DNR's legal research on the Straits to be coming out shortly from what I've seen in the paper. Excuse me. So, you know, and one of these days, Enbridge is going to have to come before Judge Jamo in Ingham County to explain what's happened to the east leg of Line 5. And as we go along, we'll also be seeing what happens with the lawsuit. You know, one thing that's interesting is, if you recall, our governor is an attorney, and so she is going to, you know, be very astute in trying to make sure that she gets the best possible use out of this information, and deciding whether she's going to join in with Nessel on the lawsuit to decommission the line, or if she's going to take a separate step. And then, of course, the MPS part is yet another part of it. So we actually have like three different prongs going at the same time, which is good for us, because that means Enbridge can't do an end run out of any one of these. It has to be able to meet the standards in every case, because they're not going to get a free ride like they did in the previous administration.
Right. And if I just add one more thing that happened even since Chairman Newland presented on August 3, is last week, the tribe was given standing to participate directly as a legal entity in the Michigan Public Service Commission review. And that had not happened in 1953. The tribes were given no standing whatsoever. And obviously, when you look at the right to hunt and fish that was granted in the treaties, how could you possibly, that's a legal conversation, you know, to that concern of they break it up, but the treaty is very clear. You have to allow access to and maintain that access. And so I think the tribals' standing and ability to make that point, our environmental laws, you know, give or take that standing of the right for an ecosystem to exist. The treaty is fundamentally based on that, as I have come to be educated by tribal lawyers. So I do think that we have this Public Service Commission process is opening up channels to fight back in ways that the other legal process did not have.
Right. And
there was just profound systematic racism.
Yeah.
And people ignored the treaties. I think they, in many cases, felt like that's irrelevant now, but it never has been irrelevant.
And in the Constitution, it says the treaties are the supreme law of the land.
Right, right.
And it helps if you have the ability to enforce that.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. So anyway, I appreciate everyone coming. I just wanted to hold this up. This is a single-use blueberry container, and this is what we're endangering the Straits of Mackinac with. So keep that in mind, you know, and what do we used to put blueberries in, and you know, strawberries, and I remember it was wood baskets.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like weaving.
Cardboard.
Yeah, and cardboard. So, you know, so we've made this vast improvement in order to be able to have better blueberries, perhaps. But I doubt it. They still, I suspect they taste the same now as they did then. And so I just wanted to, you know, reinforce this whole point of the fact that, you know, this is what we're endangering our whole ecosystem on, is to have these in a plastic container.
Yeah.
So.
Well said. I'm going to have to go. It's 9 o'clock. And
yeah, no, I appreciate it. I didn't think we would be on this long. But thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And have a good evening, and remember to keep your what do you call it, your optimism up, unlike our previous talker, and to make sure that you keep on doing what you keep on doing, because that's the only way we're going to win, because that's how Enbridge expects to win, you know, by persistence, and we have to be persistent, even more persistent than then. So,
All right. Good night.
Good
good night.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Can we talk for a minute, Evan?